All right, well, thank you. It's great to be here. I finished my undergrad here actually in 2008, and so it's nice to have the opportunity to come back and share a little bit of what I've been up to since leaving and heading off to Michigan. So before I start, let me note that this is collaborative work with Jason Owen Smith, who's also at Michigan, and it kind of sits at the intersection of our two research areas. So what we're doing is proposing outlining a new approach to the measurement of innovation. And by innovation, I mean anything that's broadly new, useful, and then somehow influential. And what we're suggesting is that new discoveries can be conceptualized as additions to evolving directed networks of interlinked components, ideas, technologies, and so on. And in doing that, you can make differentiations among innovations that might otherwise look pretty similar to one another. In particular, you can tell the effects that they have on the use of prior discoveries or related discoveries, and that those can have important implications. All right, so I'll say more about what I mean by that in just a minute, but before I do, let me get into a quick roadmap for the talk. So I'll spend a little time going over current methods. Then I'm going to go back and touch on some classic theories of innovation and technological change to kind of ground and motivate what we're doing. I'll then present two versions of measures we've been working with that we call disruptiveness and radicalness. And then I'd like to spend the rest of the time first going over some basic statistics and case studies to establish face validity, to show that this is capturing a real phenomenon. And then from there, move on to a substantive area and illustrate that this approach, this set of measures can be used to actually shed some insights onto old research problems that we care about. Okay, and then at the end, we can talk about applications, discussions, extensions, and limitations. So most research in sociology, economics, management, and other social science fields rests on one of two insights about innovation. These are kind of key foundational ideas. And the first is that innovation is fundamentally this process of recombination. So the idea here is that there's no new thing under the sun. Everything that we think of as being new is actually just a reassemblage of things that have been around, and what's novel there is the way that they've been arranged, the new kind of arrangement. And the second is that innovations, or at least important innovations, entail categorical breaks with past ways of doing things. So they involve discontinuities, right? And along with that, we make a distinction between two broad classes of measures that have been commonly used to study innovation. And they correspond somewhat to these theoretical ideas. So the first are what we call just impact measures. And they seek to quantify the extent to which something is used. So pretty straightforward. The second are what we call measures of distinctiveness. And the goal there is to see how different is something, a new idea, a new product, from everything that had been around before. Right, so these are just two broad classes, and there are a lot of types of measures and ways of cutting that in between. So some concrete examples. And social scientists have used a lot of different types of data, often embedded in documents or other types of media, to get at these. So even if you don't study innovation, you're certainly familiar with impact measures in scholarly work. You count number of citations, look at H-index, things like that. The same thing goes with patents, which also rely heavily on citations, even court cases. In more cultural areas, you might look at ticket sales for musicals or movies or downloads. Same thing with mobile apps. So it's fairly straightforward. Distinctiveness measures look a little bit different. So there, you might be looking for papers that bridge keyword areas that haven't been bridged before, or topic subject areas. Patents look at technological classifications, films that bridge genres, and so forth. And there, again, these are just broad classes. There are a wide range of ways to do this. But and what's nice about these measures, these kind of existing approaches, is that they have an intuitive appeal. So to go back to what I was saying when I started about my broad definition of innovation, we think that if something is new, it's an improvement over the prior state of affairs, that it makes sense that it would be widely used. And similarly, with distinctiveness, it tends to map on closely to real stories that we often hear about how discoveries get made. Okay, so this is a real example illustrates that. So imagine you're Mattel, the toy maker, and it's the 1970s, and you've hit on some hard times for a variety of reasons. And so you're trying to find out what's the next big thing. What can I do to kind of revitalize this company? And you've also just made purchases, acquisitions of a number of other smaller companies that do a range of different things that don't necessarily seem that related to what you're doing, and that might be one of your actual problems. But so you have expertise in plastics and toys, and one of the companies you bought makes fish bowls, bird cages, and other containers for like small animals and pets. So what do you do when you put these two things together that's going to help you turn the company around? Well, you might get something that looks like this. So this is a real patent for essentially the first plastic hamster tube cage. So I'm sure you've all seen these, and it's probably not the type of discovery that's going to win anybody a Nobel Prize, but it created a new market, a new small market, and this has since been imitated dozens of times, and it helped the company out a bit. And so that's why these measures of distinctiveness kind of map onto what we would think of as the output of these processes of recombination, and it was kind of a distinctive product. Okay, so these are important measures. They're nice, they're intuitive, but they also have some shortcomings, and in particular, their interpretation can be ambiguous at times. So even measures of impact have some of these. So think about impact. What's nice is that it differentiates among discoveries based on how much they're used. But if you have two, say, scientific papers that have been highly influential, both are cited, say, 1,000 times, you can't tell much about how they're used. So for example, you couldn't tell that one was highly cited and highly used because it opened up a new field of study, whereas the other was highly cited and highly used because it solved a central problem in an existing field and then kind of revitalized that as an area of inquiry. And we'd like to be able to make those types of distinctions when we're studying innovations. So distinctiveness, too, as a class of measures, also has some problems. So first, it's hard to integrate dynamics into that type of measure because the particular set of components that make up a discovery are fixed usually at the time that they're introduced. I mean, you can rework keyword category systems, but fundamentally the set of keywords are generally fixed when you, say, publish a paper. And then on top of that, probably the biggest problem is that it can be very difficult to know which combinations are useful and which aren't. So you might have two things that are very distinctive, but the value of them is quite different. So we can return once again to our plastic hamster tube cage example to see an illustration of this. So pretend maybe you grew up in the 1970s when Mattel released this cage. You thought it was the greatest thing from your childhood, your fond memories. And now you're a little older. You're trying to think of something that's going to help launch your career or maybe just make you some money on the side. Think of yourself as a bit of an inventor. And you also happen to like fashion. You think you've got some style. And so you're playing to your strengths. You love hamsters. You love fashion. And so what do? Well, you might end up with something like this, which is also a real patent for pet display clothing. And essentially what it does is takes one of these cages and wraps it around a Hawaiian party shirt. All right, so both are distinctive. One is animal cages and clothing. One is animal cages and plastic figurines. So both quite distinctive, but clearly one opened up a new market and the other, I haven't seen anyone wearing one of those. I mean, maybe maybe I just don't hang out with the right people. But okay, so then the question is, what do we propose? So this guy here is Joseph Schumpeter. He's a 20th century economist that really laid the foundation for a lot of contemporary thinking about innovation and technological change. And in particular, through his work, he popularized this idea of innovation as a process of recombination. He also was very interested and talked a lot about discontinuity, so discontinuous change. And even though he didn't do a lot of empirical work, he even hinted at the importance of impact as a possible measure that would be useful for studying innovation, because he made this distinction between innovation and invention. So in his idea, inventions were ideas that were relatively isolated, that didn't end up having much of an impact, whereas inventions are ideas that went on to have some kind of social and economic transformation. Okay. Right, so it sounds like what he's, I've just essentially criticized all these ideas that he's famous for, so why am I bringing him up? We think that contemporary work has really overlooked another one of the key insights of his work, and that kind of holds a lot of these ideas together. And that's that the true measure of a discovery is really not how much it's used, but how much its introduction influences the use of other existing technologies, ideas, and products. And from that, you get the idea that innovation is a relational phenomenon, or can be understood relationally and then in terms of networks. Okay? So you see that in quotes like this: economic progress in capitalist society means turmoil. New products and new methods compete with old products and old methods, not on equal terms, but a decisive advantage that may mean death to the latter. So if you read Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, it's full of stuff like this. And even his notion of creative destruction, which is the idea that a new product or technology comes along, it establishes dominance until the next best thing comes along, wipes it away, in this kind of continuous cycle. So to that, we're going to add a little bit of specificity in that we're going to distinguish between what we call amplifying innovations, which essentially increase the use of their predecessors. So they don't wipe them away, but they make them more valuable by being complementary in some way. And then what we call disrupting innovations, which are the types of what you normally associate with creative destruction, that just renders these old ideas obsolete or products obsolete. All right, so I'm going to get into the measure now, but before I do, let me just give you a little idea for the type of data we're working with. So I mentioned that social scientists have looked at innovation in a lot of different types of places, using a lot of different data. We're going to focus on patents for a few reasons. The first is that they've been used extensively already in the innovation literature, and so it makes it easier to compare what we're doing and what we find with existing studies. But on top of that, there are some institutional features of the patent system that make it attractive for studying innovation. So just like published scientific papers, patents are required to cite prior patented discoveries that they build on, that have a bearing on the novelty of the claims to intellectual property that they make. And on top of that, applicants have a strong incentive to get those citations right. Okay, so if they leave out citations that should be included, their patent can later be rendered invalid. If they go and cite their friend and the patent examiner and other people that they just want to for social reasons, they're ultimately going to weaken the value of their intellectual property claims by showing that there were many more things that came before it that kind of anticipated that discovery. Okay, and then on top of that, there are examiners that go through these reference lists and routinely will add citations that the applicant has omitted. So the benefit here, in short, is that the meaning of citations are quite clear, and then the meaning of a patent is also relatively clear. So we have about 4.1 million patents that were issued between 1976 and 2010, and among them around 42 million citations. So in terms of terminology, I'll be using the word focal patent to refer to the discovery that we want to evaluate its innovativeness. Prior art will refer to essentially everything that's in the reference list. And then forward citations is a little bit different than what you might be used to thinking, because we're not just talking about the citations to necessarily the focal patent, but also citations to the prior art. So forward citations might cite both, they might cite one, and that's going to be a key dimension of what we're trying to pick up. So here's essentially what we're trying to capture conceptually. On the top, this is what we would think of as a maximally disrupting discovery. So in the center, you have the focal patent. On the right-hand side, you have the forward citations. On the left, you have the prior art or backward citations. And you notice that what's happened here is that after this focal discovery was introduced, none of the subsequent discoveries cited the prior art. So the implication there is that somehow this innovation made its predecessors less useful. It attracted at least less attention to them. So at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have a patent that's of exactly the same impact. It's been cited just as many times, but all of the follow-on discoveries cite both it and its prior art. And so the implication there, the way at least we interpret this, is as saying this discovery has somehow made that prior art more valuable, again, by being complementary, presumably in some way. Feel free to ask questions at any time.
Clarifying question.
Yeah.
The previous slide.
Mm-hmm.
In the disrupting case, there's two things. One, you're interpreting this as causal effect on the downstream discovery process, but there's also this strategic element that you mentioned at the beginning, that this people down here might be have to think a little bit. They don't know exactly what the future impact is going to be, and they may have to think whether the upstream patent guys are going to sue them later to overturn their case because they didn't make this site. So how do you distinguish between these sort of short-term strategic calculations that will underlie this network versus, I don't know, real impact or something?
Yeah,
is this a strategic strategy choice on the part of the patentees, or is this an actual intellectual diffusion process?
It can be, and it can. There's certainly a lot of strategy involved in selecting citations, and so it's you're completely right in that sense. But I would say it's not all strategy. You need to, and the examiners will go through, and they're more of a neutral party, and will kind of parse these reference lists to try to.
How often do examiners empirically add citations?
It's very frequent. They might add up to 30% of the citations
30%?
of the reference list. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. So they do quite a bit actually, and I've been interviewing some people that do software development, and software patents aren't very good. They have a lot of problems, but they apparently routinely don't even include any citations. They just let the examiners take care of them. So the examiners have a lot of control over this. Yeah. And that's one reason we like this over, say, looking at scholarly citations, although we'd like to do that eventually. But the institutions are clear here. They're not without flaws. Certainly it's not perfect data, but the meaning is generally clearer than it is in some other places. Is that, yes?
Let's see, a downstream citation include everything that all of the prior art in its own citations? So, in other words, would all of the dots to the left also be in the reference list for any dot to the right? In the maximally disrupting case.
No, so these patents here do not cite any of these.
Okay.
Yeah. They may cite other things that aren't a part of this network.
Of course.
And you may also have things that you don't see here, but that we do take into account into our measure. Say this tie is not here, but you might have one that cites just the prior art and not the focal discovery, and that goes into our measure. Yep.
Are you also omitting edges that are only between the prior citations? Because I feel like they could be citing each other as well, like all the citations before the patent.
Yeah, we are, and so we have. So as I said, I mentioned very briefly at the beginning that these are like versions of the measures we've been working with. So this one is simplified, and we're just essentially treating these as three classes of patents. Right. The backward citations, the focal patent, and the final discovery. We have some other versions that I can go into later where we try to allow for citations within categories, and then patents that might cite heavily. So this patent might cite many pieces of prior art, and the meaning of that could also be different. But you just end up adding layers and layers of complexity there. So we have developed some ways of looking at that, but just haven't done that quite as much yet. So this is more of just a simple take on it yet. But good question. Okay, so this is a more formal presentation of the measure. Like I was just saying, we have three classes: the focal patent, the backward citations or the prior art, and then the forward citations. And so this is where you see we're dealing with classes. Do you cite a patent that's in the backward cite class or the focal class? And essentially what this does, I can go into more details, but it just accounts for the distribution of ties among those classes. Okay, so we have two measures that I'm talking about and that we'll present in the rest of this talk. One is what we call disruptiveness. And despite the name, it ranges from, it covers the full spectrum from amplifying to disrupting. We just call it disrupting because that's what people are often more interested in. And -1 are the most amplifying, +1 are the most disrupting. And the radicalness is very similar, but it allows for a weighting parameter that you can use to kind of differentiate discoveries based on the magnitude of the effect that they have on the network or technology stream going forward. Okay, so it's, and we'll end up using a citation weight here. Okay. So this is what it starts to look like when you begin running the data through that measure. So this is, look at this histogram here. This is for all about 4 million patents. And you have disruptiveness here. And so what you can see from this is a few interesting things. I mean, first, it has a fairly nice spread. But you also notice that most patents have very little effect either way on the use of their prior art. And that kind of makes sense when you think that discoveries that are either very disruptive or offer major improvements over the prior state of affairs are presumably pretty rare. You also notice that the distribution is a little bit skewed to the positive side of our measure. And that also makes sense given some institutions of the patent system, in particular that applicants are required by law to demonstrate how their discovery diverges from things that had come before. So there are requirements for novelty and non-obviousness. Another thing that's useful to note is that this measure is essentially uncorrelated with impact, only at about 0.05. And that's nice because, as I said before, we were trying to build something that was decoupled from impact. You can see here, this is a different sample. This is actually, this distribution, the dark blue, refers to all of the top 1/4% of patents by impact. Okay, and so it's a little bit flatter. The tails are a little bit thicker, which you might expect. But overall, it's not dramatically different in its shape. And then what you have in light blue is just a sample that was matched on a lot of observable characteristics like grant year, technology class, and so forth, but that were random with respect to the measure scores. And it's also interesting to note that when we were starting out with this, we had no idea that this distribution would look quite like this. And you can think that in different settings, it might look quite different if inventors were using different search strategies. The way you thought of something was that you read a patent or read a paper, and then you developed your idea by combing through the reference lists of one paper and then getting to the next, jumping that way, that maybe the distribution would be leaning a bit more towards this side. If search was random, you might expect this to be even more focused around the center or off to the right. If there were incredibly high barriers for demonstrating novelty, it might be skewed more to the left. So it's interesting to see that it actually is distributed this way. This is what it looks like over time, again, for the full population. And for substantive reasons, this is also kind of neat because in recent years, there's been an explosion of patenting, especially among big corporations like Apple, IBM, Microsoft. And with that, there have also been critiques about the Patent Office and a perception that the quality barriers for achieving a successful grant have lowered. And so if you look at this, you might see a little bit of evidence for that since back in, say, the 70s, the average patent was quite a bit more disruptive on our score, and now there's been this long decline towards zero. Yeah?
But isn't that also, isn't that just be explained by censoring of the data?
Yeah, it's possible, but, and there might be some of that going on, but I have some things that I can show you that make me think that it's not the full story, at least. So we've looked a little bit at how this changes over time and about how long it takes a particular discovery to reach essentially like a stable value on this measure. Okay. All right, so I've given you a critique of some earlier work, given you a few basic descriptive statistics, and a conceptual outline of what we're doing. Now I'm going to show you some examples. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We've really looked through a lot of these and found a lot of evidence to support that this is really picking up what we're after. So this is one of the foundational patents of biotechnology. And it, together with a handful of other discoveries, really laid the foundation for the industry, and in doing so, rendered a lot of the techniques used by pharmaceutical companies obsolete. So it's just the type of thing we would hope would score really high on our measure, positively on our measure of disruptiveness, and it does. It's at about 0.95. And you'll see all these green dots are patents that cite just the focal discovery. These blue triangles cite just the prior art. And there aren't any that actually cite both. And then this is what it looks like over time. So this is just an N of 1. I have some more systematic data about when these things level off, but it only took this about 4 or 5 years before it was pretty clear.
Just a little case study, only 2 backward citations, so the patent office didn't try to beef that up on them? I mean, just as a case study?
No, and actually, it's possible to have a patent that doesn't even cite any prior art. And that's taken a lot of times in the literature to be indicative of something that's actually like really novel. You know, it doesn't happen too often, but they can vary a lot between having none to some have several hundred prior citations.
But Schumpeter and everybody believes nothing comes from nothing, you know. So everything's a recombination of something, and this is apparently not.
Not necessarily everything's been patented before either. So one thing that would be nice to look at that we haven't done yet is that we're only looking at prior patented inventions. There's also a section on each patent for non-patent prior art. So this is where you get scientific publications and technical documents and things like that that are cited as well. So, but yeah, it is possible not to, you know, I don't know if the patent office reads Schumpeter or what, but for the most part, the vast majority of things, it's the exception to the rule to have something that doesn't cite anything. Yes?
Are these waves of relevance common? So there's a big cluster in, I can't read the years there, it looks like 1986 or thereabouts. Yeah, that year, and then towards the later year.
Yeah, I don't really have a good explanation for this other than, well, there are 2, I mean, there's the interesting substantive explanation that something we'd like to look at, that some discoveries become more valuable over time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there's not inherent value in a discovery, but that as people learn about them, as fields develop, as markets develop, some things become more valuable.
It's the second wave, though, that's really intriguing on that.
Yeah, the other explanation is that, as I said before, patenting has increased a lot over time, especially over this period. And so even though the scores haven't changed that much, it's possible that just more patents are being issued and so more are citing them. Yes?
So can patents explicitly have a citation for a research paper or a scholarly paper, or is that not common for patents? Because I think for a discovery like this, I think most of the citations would probably be from scientific literature, given the nature of the patent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's possible, and it's common too. And again, so that's why it's more common in some areas than others. And biotechnology and biochemistry is one of them that's more common. And so it would be nice to, this is a patent on, one of the first patents on a method for deriving stem cells. And this is the patented documents. These are the scientific documents. So, we'd love to get at this, but the data are just a complete disaster. Patents are nice because they have a unique identifier. This is even worse than if you were to say pull citations from Web of Science or something, because it's just yeah, it's complete.
Strings of characters.
Yeah. So eventually we'd like to get at that. But
and the other thing I was going to say was, it seems really obvious to me that, well, especially on this graph now, that there's like a new discovery or some new trend that happens at these like discrete points in time where the paper is being cited really frequently because of some new thing. Like, especially in stem cell research, if there's like a new thing that people have, or like a new piece of DNA that people have figured out that they want to put into a stem cell, then everyone's going to be trying to do that right at one time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's definitely like an unexplainable phenomenon. I don't think it's just random that all these people have, oh, it's 2003, let's all say this paper. It's 2004, let's all say.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that there are, I know that there are factors exogenous to the patent system that help explain some of these trends. And that's, I think, an interesting substantive question to really look at. And one of the reasons why I put these down here, to show you how this changes over time. So this is actually, some of you might be familiar with this patent, and if not, you've surely used it. It's Google's, the patent on the algorithm that Google uses to rank its search results. Okay, and it was kind of an interesting, novel idea because it took insights from computer science, information retrieval, and combined them with insights from social network analysis. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Mark Mizrachi. He's one of my advisors back at Michigan. He's actually cited in this Google PageRank patent. It's kind of cool. But so, so kind of a novel idea. It was a big improvement over the state of the art at the time because most search engines were using things like how often is the page updated and so forth to rank their results. What this did is took essentially like a measure of network centrality, how many pages cite this page, to assign importance to pages. And that's still a big part of how the results that you get in your Google search end up showing up. But you see that unlike this, where it was really clear early on what's happening here, nobody paid much attention to PageRank. Everything was still citing its prior art until about 2006, 2007, maybe when Google started gaining much more prominence than it already had at this point, in which case there's just this dramatic shift to all these green dots that are only citing Google and not its prior art. Okay. All right. This is, again, now the polar opposite case from that first biotechnology patent. So this is essentially a discovery on a super plant. It was issued to Monsanto, which is a big agricultural biotechnology company. And it's a soybean that's resistant to all sorts of stuff like shattering, a bunch of diseases, but most importantly to glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup Ready, an herbicide. It's actually the #1 market-leading herbicide worldwide. And what this did was build on, first of all, Monsanto's earlier patented discovery of glyphosate. So they patented that back in the 70s. And then these patents, which almost all of these are owned in whole or in part by Monsanto, and they cover things like the different genetic sequences that are required for this glyphosate resistance and these other properties. And so you can see why this is the type of measure that we would hope, or type of discovery that we would hope would score very highly on the negative end of our measure, because it makes these prior discoveries more valuable. So if a farmer places an order for a set of these seeds, you might think that they'd also be interested in maybe having other seeds that are also resistant to, for their other crops that are resistant to glyphosate. And so then other inventors might invent, say, a corn seed or something like that that's resistant to glyphosate, so they build on Monsanto's technology. So
did you say all three of these are Monsanto?
I think, well, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, but there are about 5. I think 4 are owned by Monsanto, and then 1 is owned by a different company that Monsanto has a minority stake in. Yeah, so it's...
So this is maybe nothing to do with intellectual influence. This is market power. Some sort of a monopoly.
Maybe, but it's still...
I mean, are they disproportionately amplifying Monsanto patents as opposed to other people's patents?
In this case?
Is the yellow one is Monsanto also?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
So
yes,
the 2 big red ones are also Monsanto?
Yeah, so this is great for Monsanto, yeah. But not all of these are necessarily Monsanto.
No.
Yeah, so you get other companies that are building on, not only building on this discovery, but then also using, and presumably creating more products that are complementary to these earlier Monsanto technologies.
I'm just playing with my cynical hypothesis that it's strategic, because Monsanto, if they don't cite the old patent as well as the new patent, Monsanto's going to kill them in court.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really sympathetic to that view too.
So
I think this is
strategic type.
No, I think there's a lot of strategy, market power, and dynamics like that going on. But that's also consistent with Schumpeter, what he was saying about the types of discoveries that incumbent firms that face little competition are likely to come up with.
Sure.
And but Monsanto might be vulnerable to the small type of marginal startup that then comes along and develops a whole different type of way of protecting plants against disease and that. So yeah, no, I think that's one of the really interesting questions and things to figure out is how market dynamics come into this and market power. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, like, what the point that Professor Padgett just brought up, whether, because your measure of influence is just a function of utility, basically. And in the market dynamics case, I might have some legal power, so there could be a conflict between influence and utility there.
I'm sorry. The difference between
influence and utility, conceptually. Mm-hmm. And then so there's a power dynamic situation in the example just going on where you can have a conflict between the utility of the innovation and adoption based on the power dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think they're intertwined. I don't want you to get too caught up with this particular example. One of the reasons I picked this is because one area where people have been interested not in these disruptive innovations, but in these enhancing innovations is in the business strategy literature, for obvious reasons. And so this case is prominent there, and so it's one of the reasons why I picked it, and because it fit really well. But it's hard to disentangle. Again, I don't think this is all strategy, because this isn't just Monsanto. They have to go through the patent system. They're also subject to, they're subject to antitrust. They're also subject to challenging this patent based on whether it's novel or not novel. So if someone can demonstrate that this patent's not novel because it doesn't advance over this prior art enough, it can be rendered invalid, in which case someone else that may have produced something similar would then be able to take that over from Monsanto. So their patents can't just be complete, can't be a complete farce. There has to be something behind this. But that's not to say that these power dynamics aren't also really important. So, okay. So I've given you the critique of early measures, given you a conceptual overview of the phenomenon we're interested in and trying to capture, and a set of measures, some basic descriptive statistics, and some, you can say, like suggestive case studies. Raise some questions, but give you a little flavor. What I'd like to do now, and what I think would show that this measure is actually particularly useful, is if it can shed insight into some substantive areas that we care about, like market power and that. And so I'll be turning to a discussion of university patenting and commercialization. This has been important in public dialogues and also an interesting research area among academics that study innovation and universities. And so it's the type of area that might benefit from a new perspective or a new way of looking at things, a new measure. So it's a bridge between the more earlier discussions of face validity and the substantive area application. Let me just point you to this figure. What we were doing here is we were interested in measuring the effect that citation by a disruptive patent had on the use of its prior art. Or another way of putting that is the counterfactual. So what would have happened to a patent had it not been cited by a disruptive innovation? Can we differentiate those two trajectories? And so what we did is we took all patents that had been issued to the top 110 US research universities by federal R&D expenditures between 1981 and 2005. And we calculated their scores, their disruptiveness scores, and pulled out those that were one standard deviation above the mean on the positive end of the spectrum. Okay? And then we put them into dyads with their prior art, so focal disruptive patent, prior art dyads. Then once we had those, we went out looking for control cases that were similar on observable characteristics like the application year, the grant year, the technology class, the years separating the two, the impact of the prior art. And then we just went ahead and plotted the average number of citations received by the two groups relative to the issue year times 0 of the focal patent, so the disruptive patent. And what we found kind of fits with what we were expecting, that the blue line it represents citations to the prior art that were cited by the disruptive patent. So it's like our treated case, whereas the red are the control. And you see that they receive far fewer citations. And if you use difference in differences estimation, you find out that it's about 61% fewer citations after 5 years than you might expect an average patent of that type to receive otherwise. Okay. So now for the real substantive demonstration. In 1980, Congress passed the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed organizations to seek patents and issue licenses on discoveries that had been made using federal funding. And with that, there was an explosion in university patenting and increasing commercial engagement. And so this has generated a lot of controversy, again, in the public, also among academics. And the question is, at least in policy circles, is generally like, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And then, there are some people that say this is great. It fast tracks discoveries from universities to the private sector, which creates jobs, creates entrepreneurship and new companies, and ultimately propels economic growth. Other people have a more muted take and are worried that as universities move more towards the commercial sphere, it distracts them from their core mission of knowledge creation and dissemination, when they start getting involved with private property rights on knowledge. Academic researchers, as I said, that are interested in innovation in universities have also been interested in these normative questions. Is this good? Is this bad? But also more basic questions that get at just understanding the phenomenon. Like, does commercial engagement actually have any effect on the quality of academic science, whether it's good or bad? And then also performance questions. So if we are really interested in commercializing academic research, what's the best way to do it? Do you want a strong scientific base? Do you want funding from the federal government? What's the best way to go about doing that? And so this has also produced a lot of contradictory results, contradictory empirical findings. So what we did is we assembled a data set in which we tried to replicate about as many studies as we could reasonably expect to do. Again, we're looking at the top 110 US research universities by R&D expenditures between 1981 and 2005. Actually, for this, we're just looking at 2003 to 2005 for a number of reasons I'm happy to go into. And we consider 4 independent variables. So we've got our competitors here. We've got impact and new combinations, which is just the number of patents that a university registers at time t+1 that bridge to new technology categories. So that's our distinctiveness measure. Then we have disruptiveness, and then we have radicalness, which remember is our weighted, our magnitude weighted version of disruptiveness. And I'll go over a couple different independent variables. So we'll look at scientific productivity measured by the quantity of publications and the quality. It's captured by impact. And then I'm also going to focus mostly on ties to the government and ties to industry. These are panel models, negative binomial and OLS. And I'm happy to go, so these are just, it's kind of annoying because these are 4 just fully specified models, but you just have to trust me that these, these make sense. So, okay, so here, let me draw your attention first to the indicators of science. So we have number of articles, so just quantity, and then we have impact factor, which is quality. And if you look at impact, you see, okay, this makes sense. The higher quality, the higher quantity of science the university has, the higher impact patents they tend to produce.
The unit of analysis is a university year.
University
So the University of Chicago has published so many scientific articles in that year,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a data set of 100.
Then in the next year,
And 100, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. Then in the next year, University of Chicago produces patents of X patents of this weighted by this impact. Exactly. Yeah. So it's a university analysis and portfolio level. We don't get much at all from combinations. It's not really clear what the effect of science is on producing distinctive innovations. It's a little clear from disruptiveness and radicalness. We see, okay, there is higher quality science seems to lead to universities to produce commercial innovations that disrupt the status quo, so that are different from those that are already being pursued and developed in established areas. Okay, so nothing too surprising there. But where it gets really interesting is when you look at ties to industry and then ties to government. And this is where it's been, again, most controversial in terms of findings in the existing literature. So we have 2 measures of ties to industry. The first is just funding for, it's essentially sponsored research. How much the amount of dollars that industry is given to a university to pursue research projects. And you see that, well, looks like as industry funding increases, the impact increases, which may make sense. So does the distinctiveness of patents. Okay, but then it doesn't make much sense when you look at what we call industry contracts, which are licenses and then R&D agreements. You get the opposite case. So having contracts with universities seems to lead to lower impact patents and then also less distinctive patents. And again, these are replicated from prior studies. When you look at there's not much going on with disruptiveness, but when you look at the magnitude weighted, you get a much more consistent story that working with industry leads universities to produce patents that tend to amplify and enhance the status quo in terms of technology. So they're producing patents that look more like that Monsanto seed discovery than like the biotech patent. Okay? So we get some nice consistency here. And that makes sense when you think about, again, going back to Schumpeter, the types of innovations that industry wants to produce. They don't want to produce things that are going to cannibalize their own existing products. They want to build things that enhance them. The exact opposite is true when you look at government ties. So first of all, notice that we're not getting much action at all. So this might upset some people at the NSF or the NIH, but we don't find much evidence at all that getting more NSF grants or getting more NIH grants has any effect on the impact or the number of new combinations that universities produce for in terms of patents. Government interest is just a broader measure that documents whether or not in a patent a university reported receiving funds from any government agency. But we get a very consistent story, not again much going on with disruptiveness a little bit, but when we look at radicalness, we get...
Could you go back and explain radicalness? I mean, you explained disruptiveness very well, but radicalness didn't get as much attention, so I missed it. Sorry.
So what we're trying...
What is radicalness?
Radicalness is it's essentially the same thing as disruptiveness, but what we're doing here is multiplying it by the number of citations that a patent ultimately received. Because the reason we do that is we'd like to differentiate between something that was highly disruptive, but in a technology stream that only involved maybe 2 subsequent discoveries, versus something like this, which involved...
So it's just a truncated, go back to the formula again?
Mm-hmm.
So R equals D, but it's just truncated only for positive values of W?
No.
Is that what you mean?
No, it's all values.
Well, then what is this comma W greater than?
I
don't know how to read that.
You have to have we're just saying you need a positive weight.
So
for impact. So as long as you don't have negative citations, so you probably, it's probably obvious you don't really need that to be there. Yeah. So here, the value of disruptiveness is 0.95 because it's bounded by -1 to 1. Here, radicalness is 332.5, which is almost exactly the same as the number of forward citations it received. The Monsanto patent, disruptiveness is -0.85, whereas radicalness is -127. So they're going in the opposite direction. It's related to their impact as of 2010, but it's different and they're kind of diverging from one another. Does that answer your question?
I want to see if I can make that a little bit clearer. So the weight is the same whether or not the patent is going in the or whether or not the citation is going in the forward or backward direction. But if it's going in the backward direction, then the weight will obviously make it more negative, and if it's going in the forward direction, the weight will make it more positive.
Exactly.
So it's just like saying, okay, this patent is disruptive to a certain degree. How broadly disruptive is it? Right?
Exactly.
How widely disruptive is it? How like far away from itself has it infiltrated the rest of industry?
Exactly. Yeah. So you might think there could be a lot of different ways of weighting that, but we just wanted to get something in there that would differentiate between something that had been widely used and something that hadn't been used so much. Right. Okay. And oops. So just to finish up, we get when we look at radicalness. So again, it looks like the weighting is important because we're not getting much, at least at the university level, when we just look at disruptiveness. But we get a very consistent story about what government funding does to the character of university patents across a variety of different data sources. So the NSF, NIH are 2 different data sources. Government interest is coming from a completely different data source, but we find very consistently that they have positive effects on radicalness, meaning that they produce patents that look more like that foundational biotech patent, less like that Monsanto patent, which makes sense also when you think that the goal of government funding is often to produce discoveries that are long-term, based on basic science, and that hopefully open up new industries and new domains and so on. Yes?
Could you tell us what the average level of what the intercept of those models are, and like a sense of like what for maybe let's take one of those variables, NIH, the governmental grant support, how much of a difference it really we should expect that to make for an average university year?
Yeah, I don't know. So these are, unfortunately, I don't have that with me. So these are fixed effects too. So it's just within universities,
Okay.
not
I guess
across
it's a little bit hard to
universities.
say, like, are those big numbers or small numbers? I mean, it's a little bit, so what should we, like, on average, are they going to be amplifying, or, like, what would happen, maybe it'd be helpful, like, it'd be helpful to kind of talk about what is the substantive effect of these in addition to the model?
Yeah. Well, probably about the best I can do right now is show you the differences in the relative coefficient sizes, and so government interest. This is a really noisy indicator of how much support a university receives. But we see roughly, certainly same magnitude. This is about 11. This is about 19 for NSF grants relative to NIH grants. Industry ties have negative effects, but relative to government funding, they're much smaller. So industry-sponsored R&D is only about -1, whereas industry contracts.
But it's also hard. We don't know what the scales are of those things. But the takeaway is mainly the science of the science of these coefficients.
That's what we were focusing on.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, especially because we're looking at 4 different dependent variables, and it's hard to compare across models in other ways. Yeah.
Just maybe you can help me again, but it goes back to this radicalness, disruptiveness. You showed me the formula, and that was very useful. But the numerators of those formulas were the same, and the denominators is what they made them different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go back to yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the numerators in these measures are identical, and the denominators are completely different. So you're getting radically different effects in your final statistics based on manipulating these denominators, which I find hard to interpret.
Yeah.
Well,
It's just the only reason for that is really just an effect of trying to simplify these, which may have added more confusion. So you would get the same thing literally if you just put parentheses, around this, and then once you calculated it, multiplied by the by the final, like whatever you decided to weight. We just didn't want to, we wanted to develop a measure where it was clear you could use a different type of weight. But then this thing is ultimately equivalent to, when you use forward citations, it ends up being equivalent to this n, and so then they cancel out, and so you can't see quite as much what's happening there. So it's mostly a matter of
if
presentation.
you just did a radical simplification, and d equals 1 over nt, and r equals 1 over wt for w greater than 0. In other words, throw away everything that's of interest, and you just did this sort of idiot model.
Mm-hmm.
Would you still find this similar statistical effects?
Yeah, so before we had something like that when we started out, and then before we decided to get sophisticated with this, and it was essentially just, I think we had A plus B, which is like the number of citations that cite. Our original was basically some. Now my thing's not working. Was basically something like the numerator was how many citations do you have that cite just the focal patent minus how many you have that cite both over the total number of citations to either the focal or the prior art. Would be another simpler way to, does that make sense? And then to get radicalness, you just multiply it by the full number of forward citations. Yes?
So going back to these equations, first of all, I think there might be a typo. I think that WT in the denominator should be an I, because there's a different weight for each term in the sum, right?
Yeah.
Presumably. Also, I think it's worth noting that n sub t is just a normalizing factor. All it does is get that value between -1 and 1.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
So the important point of comparison here isn't the radicalness of one thing to the radicalness of another thing. It's the disruptiveness of one thing to the radicalness of the same thing. That's the important thing. Because if you have like a radicalness of 20, that means that those weights contributed a multiple of 20 to that disruptiveness, which is saying a lot, right? So I think that if you go back to the table that you had, like, I think the most amazing thing in this entire field, to me at least, is that the NSF grants went from a negative disruptiveness to a positive radicalness.
Mm-hmm.
That means that the citations that were positively disruptive were weighted much, much more highly than the citations that were negatively disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
Enough to flip it from negative to positive, which is saying a lot.
Yeah.
It means that the positively disruptive citations were very distributed. They like infiltrated a lot of different areas, and that's saying something about what the government funding does. You know, it magnifies things that are broad. It takes things that might not get funding because they have such loose effects and makes them plausible to support.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah, we should talk more about that later. Done. Okay, as just a way of wrapping up, I think we're essentially finished here. So, I think what I've given you a new measure. I've critiqued some old measures, given you some evidence of face validity, demonstrated that it can offer us some new insights or at least some clarity into existing debates. I think there are a number of other places where this might be useful. First would be in corporate strategy, going to what we talked about earlier with market power, competition, and innovation, which has been an area that's had just as many conflicting findings as the work on universities. So this would be a really neat place to look. You could look at social networks. There's been a lot of questions about whether more open or more closed structures are better for promoting innovation, so structural holes or cohesion. This might add some nuance. Science policy, again, there's a lot of interest today within policy circles about how do you get the most out of your grant dollars, how do you fund transformative research, might be useful there. Might be also useful for thinking about how do we develop regional clusters, how do we understand them, do some areas produce discoveries that are much more amplifying of the status quo, whereas others are characterized by disruptive innovation. And then there are things that we need to do. I mean, one of them obviously is trying to figure out how this could extend to other data sets where it might be useful beyond patents. Something that would be important, especially here, but also in other areas, is the need potentially to infer citations that are missing. So this could be useful for getting around problems of strategy where companies might leave citations out on purpose to help get something through and hope that their small competitor doesn't have the money to sue them and overturn their patent. You could do that with natural language processing or other things, presumably. It'd also be interesting to look at second and third order types of influence. So not just directly within a technology stream, but how does a disruptive discovery influence neighboring technological streams? And then also settings where ties can be added or removed. So the nice thing about the patent data, citation data, is that once you cite something, you can't uncite it. But you can, if you're a website, you can remove a link. And so it would be nice to be able to figure out how you could take a measure like this or a way of thinking like this where ties can be added and removed and adapted to that type of context. So, thank you.
So I have two kind of unrelated questions. The first question has to do with the issue of how disruptiveness is distributed across patent classes. Have you done an analysis?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked.
Clever.
So we find that it's, there are probably more similarities than differences.
Mm-hmm.
So one that a lot of people are probably interested in is what do software patents look like, given the problems with software patents. And we find that they fit relatively, it's broadly similar to other categories, but they do less to either amplify or disrupt the use of other patents, which could, be, part of that might be due to the fact that the prior art is a mess in the software category, because up until I think maybe the mid-90s, there really weren't good ways of classifying software patents. So if you developed a software system for pizza delivery, it would be classified under like kitchens, not software. So, but it doesn't look all that different. And then here's, for example, so you see some differences by technology area. So here's biotechnology. And what this is here are discoveries that score 1. And so this is either a feature or a bug, depending on your take. But some of these are genuinely, they have prior art citations, and just all of them ignore, all the subsequent discoveries ignore them. But some of these are just patents that have no prior art. And so everything has to cite them if they're going to cite them. They can't cite the prior art. So if you view not having prior art as an indication of novelty, that there's just nothing out there that is even close to what you're doing, then that's valuable. If you view it as being primarily determined by strategy, then you might see this as being a bit of a problem. In which case, you would want to infer links, which is why I had that up there.
What are the other areas, just for comparison?
Let's see, this is chemical patents, software. This is electrical, miscellaneous, mechanical, and then biotechnology. And so you see that in electrical, which has been around, people have been producing electrical patents for a long time, and the prior art's more organized, you see that come down. So that might be some indication either, again, of novelty or strategy. It's somewhat unclear. Yeah.
So the second question, which I started thinking about on the basis of your example of very disruptive patent, this code transformation.
Yeah,
and the question really has to do with how the prior art is being used in the patent. So in other words, one possibility, which is I think the kind of Schumpeterian interpretation that you've been giving, is one about, in essence, the sort of substitution of the patent for the prior art. So in other words, once this patent exists, no one has any need for the prior art because it essentially substitutes. But another interpretation would have to do with the transformation of the knowledge space represented by the focal patent, right? Because part of the whole citing thing and the patenting thing has to do with this kind of ideal worker in the person having ordinary skill in the art, right? And so one thing you could imagine a disruptive patent doing is transforming the floor of what a person having ordinary skill in the art is supposedly able to do or not able to do. So I'm just curious, how, if you've sort of dug in these case studies into how prior art is used and, what's really going on in some of these specific cases.
Yeah, well, often, if you read a patent, it reads in many cases like a scientific paper, in that they'll say, so-and-so demonstrated that, so-and-so has documented in patent, blah, 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 demonstrated that genetic material could be integrated into the soybean seed because of blah, blah, blah. So it ends up, and so that bounds the scope of the novelty claims, because you're not able to claim that you've come up with a new method for inserting this into. So that's pretty much how it gets it. And I guess I'm not quite seeing how those two scenarios that you described are necessarily different. It seems to me like they could both be happening simultaneously, that as a field, on the one hand, it says being a disruptive innovation renders old things useless, but then also advances what is expected for a person with ordinary skill in the art to know, right?
I guess what I'm saying is that in the latter case, essentially all of the prior art that you might previously be manipulating is sort of bundled, in a sense, in whatever the focal patent is. So what it takes to not be doing just what the kind of imaginary normal guy would be able to do has to, at minimum, use whatever it is that's been demonstrated as now a matter of course in the focal patent.
It's about making it better. It's about synthesizing what's going on before and turning it into a black box that everyone now is
obliged to
use. So it's a synthetic piece as opposed to a substitution.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. I don't know if I have a very good response for that. I think that in my mind, I think that both do happen. I think that anything that I guess I'm still having trouble kind of differentiating, you know, between those two
Well,
different pieces. Yeah.
Could you go back to the biotech one again?
Yeah.
This is related to this previous question. You know, I guess I talked to Jason and Woody, and I know a lot about this case through osmosis, so to speak. And you know, a lot of what they tell me, is that this is, in a way, sort of a misleading picture because what's going on is a transfer of sort of normal, ordinary business in the science lab, in the publication world, for the first time into the commercial world. So this, on the one hand, is extremely radical and innovative, but that does not necessarily mean it doesn't have a prior art. It's just that the prior art was not in the patent world. It was in the publication world, you know, in the world of normal science. So if you actually had data, and you told me it's a headache and so forth and so on, but if all those actual publications, it wouldn't surprise me that there were extremely lengthy list of publications in this patent, even though there are no prior patents. And it's basically just because they're stealing stuff from the universities and commercializing it, you know? So it's not obviously as radical on the science side as it appears, you know? So, I mean, it's just transposition and refunctionality, as we and Woody call it.
Well, that's true, but there's also innovation in that as well. I mean, so for example, with the PageRank patent, you know, I don't know.
Innovation, I agree, but it's more on the organizational side than on the intellectual side.
Yeah. So, but you know, as you were saying before, everything has, you know, some predecessor.
Right.
And so, this may have been the first move of something like social network analysis.
Is there any hope of getting the publication data into?
There is. Yeah, there is. I mean, I want to. I haven't. You know, I haven't had the time. We've just finished doing a lot of this, so it's one of the next steps is to be able to do that. And then also, it's important to keep in mind that in some of these areas, you'll see hardly any scientific publications. So biotech is one example, you know, an extreme example of where there's a lot of scientific activity happening. But some of these established technological areas, there's just very, very little citation of. So it varies a lot by class. So another thing we need to do is actually start breaking this out even more systematically by those technology areas. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's a very subjective thing to say that you know, like I know you're kind of hyperbolizing, but to like steal from you know, these universities and then it makes them an industry. I mean, there are so many papers that come out of universities, you know, or like academic research that never hit industry, and like just being able to take a synthesis of papers and come up with like a product or a methodology that can actually be used in industry feasibly that makes monetary sense, et cetera, is like
exaggerating, I agree.
Huge,
But this diagram exaggerates in the other direction, I think.
No, but there is
any mention of scientific papers.
There is novelty in being able to take, you know, sociological research on centrality scores, you know, like what Mark Mizrachi was doing, and turn that into an algorithm for ranking search results on the internet, you know, which is what this was really doing. So it's not immediately obvious how you go from
Transposition.
Yeah, exactly. So there is novelty in that transposition, I think. Yes?
No, the case study examples are not giving me the graphs that I would expect for something that's disruptive. Except for PageRank is actually probably the closest one, because you don't see a lot of prior art before that is one that is highly connected to the forward citations until the focal thing comes out, and then there are no more citations. You don't see the break between, you know, a highly dense previous set of patents that are no longer, or that become disconnected from the flow of innovation because of this one patent. You don't. In the case of your highly disruptive patent, the very first one.
Biotech patent.
Yeah. So what I see in that is a field-defining patent. It's a patent that doesn't cite anything else because there's nothing to cite. It basically comes up with the process for inserting DNA into cells, which becomes fundamental to modern biology and genomics. So I think so first of all, I'm not quite buying that this is that you're actually measuring disruptiveness based on the formula that you have, which, if I read the formula correctly, it is the difference between forward citations that cite only the focal citation, the difference between that and those that cite both that focal one and the prior one. So that would, one, easily explain why everything is left skewed, because you can't add citations later on to previous publications. So the longer the time horizon, the more likely you're going to get forward citations that are going to give you, that are just going to cite the prior art. But, so, I guess what I think is what I don't see here is a measure of the connectedness of the prior art of the focal patent. I don't know how important the prior art is. Like, is there a community that's being cut off because of this new innovation?
Yeah, and it's possible. So one thing that you're missing from this, and something I probably should include, is that these, up until this point, if you cut it off here, actually, like, it would appear as though these have no citations. So, but these have been accumulating citations the whole time, and so you don't see that in these figures. But in the models that we've been considering, like this and then these, we've been controlling for the impact of prior art, and then even in this histogram here, we were controlling for the impact of the prior art, because the idea is that it would be harder to disrupt a technology stream that's very active and vibrant than it would be for one that essentially has no community built around it already. So we have taken that into account. I guess it's not taken into account in the measure, which seems to be what you're hoping to see. But we've dealt with that a bit more in an empirical way by controlling some of these various factors. Yeah.
I think one of the confusing things is that you can have a negative disruptiveness. I think, so to me, if you have only papers, only forward papers that cite just that patent, then it makes sense that the disruptiveness is 1, because then nobody before is getting included in like this new industry or this new like channel of research or whatever, right? But a disruptiveness of 0 does not correspond to 0 disruptiveness in this model to me, because there are still papers which are being cut off from the past. There are still forward papers which are not citing some backwards papers. That's true, right?
Yeah.
So the disruptiveness of 0 to me seems like it wouldn't disrupt anything. And I'm having a hard time conceptualizing what it means to not disrupt anything. Well, it seems to me like then the status quo would be maintained, and that patent would be just like any other patent, or would be just like any other thing, right? So do we have like, what's the average? Like, what's the average disruptiveness? Is it 0?
Yeah. It is 0.
Yeah. So I think that. Okay. All right. I'm cool with. I think it's fairly good definition.
Okay.
I think it's fairly good.
Yeah.
It's
No.
not a process.
That's yeah, and that was one of the things that we kind of liked, is that even among, this is a really elite sample. This is the top quarter of 1% of the most highly cited patents. So the things where you see, all the patents, the basic patents of biotech, the basic patents like PageRank, everything that's you can think of that's really had a big impact over the past 30 years. But even among this elite sample, the average is still 0.
Yeah, it's amazing. The most common patents have an equal number of citations that cite it and things before it that it cited. That's very, almost, I can't believe that's true.
Yeah, but I mean, it's neat that it worked out that way. And that's one of the reasons why we were really concerned with trying to see what is the connection to impact, and why we were happy when we found out that it's not very highly correlated at all. Yeah. So just because you're used often doesn't mean that you necessarily do anything to change a technology stream. So if you were looking at scientific publications, maybe something like this is like, the 3rd or 4th paper in a new field, that ends up getting cited a lot because it was an early paper, but it wasn't the foundational one, as well. So. Yes.
It actually, that seems weird. That you would think that the disruptive patents would have higher impact scores. That they would be important. That they would be cited. And of course, it's not within the quantitative measures. Disruptiveness is not the best quantitative measure, because it doesn't wait for the number of forward versus backward citations. And so you would be wanting to look at, you would think that there would be a correlation between impact and radicalness. Because things that are radical, that are disruptive, and that are highly cited within, or should have a high impact.
Well, there has to be, because impact is basically basic radicalism is a composite measure of disruptiveness and impact. So, like, I'm sure that there are highly
There's a very high correlation between impact and radicalness. So radicalness, in a way, is just a different type of impact measure, but it lets you see, it also lets you see the direction of the
impact. It's a very specific kind of impact measure. It's an impact of things that are disruptive. So it's not necessarily just impact, but it's a combination of the two. So I feel like there's something there that you can get at that says, this is what kind of disruption is actually not just disruptive, but highly impacting.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can have some more conversation.
Yeah.
But I think we've got
Okay.
your speaker again.